In an ancient worldview where you have multiple idols, gods for every nation, for every tribe, it is important for people to realize that the God of Scriptures is a God unlike any other idol. This is a God who is able to do abundantly more than we can ever fathom. This is a God who has the power to dish out judgment by using the sea and the waves and the sky. This is a God who rules over everything in creation. He is a king of heaven. He does not dwell in tents made by men. He does not dwell in temples that are hewn of stone. God dwells in the highest heaven. God dwells over all of creation. His person fills all of creation. We can see him in the creativity of all of the world. We can see him in the awe-inspiring and striking places of all creation. God is the one who sustains all things. Well, hello again, and welcome back to Disciple Makers. To live is Christ. I am Carlos Garduño, and today we continue studying through the book of Jonah. And last time we looked at chapter 1 and talking about how Jonah represents not only a historical figure, but in him, his actions and the response that he gives to God calling him to serve him and to go to the people of Nineveh to prophesy to them. His reluctant nature, meaning his selfishness, his lack of awareness of who he is and who God is. And then also to see the way that he responds in disobedience to God, which again, it is in a negative sense. It is a wonderful source of hope to know that if a prophet of God who knows of him has heard and experienced his love, his majesty, all that comes with being God, if a prophet was able to experience that and still disobey him, then perhaps there's also hope for us who are called to be disciples, to be ambassadors of his kingdom, to be people who make disciples of others from any nation, language, tribe, tongue, you name it. We have hope because clearly God, in his mercy, reaches out to us today too. And so, to continue going through this particular series, let me pull up the screen so you may see the window. And today we're going to Logos so you can see where we are. And this is where we are seeing. Let me see, make sure that. Nope, it's not moving. Okay. So we're going to see chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. Listen to the words, and then we'll go back over them. Jonah is now swallowed by the great big fish after he has been jettisoned from the cargo ship. And this is what we hear from the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Then Jonah prayed to Yahweh and his God from the stomach of the fish, and he said, I called out of my distress to Yahweh, and he answered me. I cried for help from the belly of Sheol. You heard my voice. For you have cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the currents surrounded me. And the currents surrounded me. All your breakers and waves passed over me. So I said, I have been driven away from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. Water encompassed me to my very soul. The great deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the base of the mountains. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. But you have brought up my life from the pit, O Yahweh, my God. While my soul was fainting within me, I remembered Yahweh, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their loving kindness, but as for me, I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. That which I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. Then Yahweh spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto dry land. So here we see a very intimate picture of this prophet of God who is showing his humanity. This man who is showing his very real struggle, his very real issue, if you will, with who God is now that he has encountered him and who the man himself is, as to who he is in his choices, the consequences thereof, And just in, if we can be honest, his sinfulness. Something that comes up as we read this is the idea of humanity not being exactly what humanity desires to be. And that is evident again in Jonah's behavior in chapter 1, but also as we see here. Look at the way in which he reaches out toward the Father. For example, if we come back now to verse 1, or I should say verse 2, and he said, I called out of my distress to Yahweh, and he answered me. Jonah, even though he's reluctant and extremely disobedient, he confesses that God, in his mercy, has reached out to him by hearing him, by answering him as he calls out in his distress. And not only that, but we also see here that even as he thought at one point in the beginning of chapter 1 that he could go away from the presence of God, now he acknowledges something simply in the way that he petitions God. I cried for help in the belly of Sheol, you heard my voice. In order to hear something from a human perspective, you need to be within earshot of that. And so, if God can hear from the deep of Sheol, then truly God is not just limited to the land of the living. God is everywhere all at once, in the depth of the earth, in the highest mountain, even beyond the highest and most distant galaxy, visible and known to man. God is there. And so Jonah confesses that he cries out to God from a remote, displaced area of the creation, and God hears him. He hears his voice. Then we also see here that he acknowledges exactly what God has done. For you, God, have cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, because he was jettisoned from the boat out into water, but then this big fish swallowed him. And what we see here is that the current surrounded him, and the breakers and waves passed over me, almost like suffering and judgment passing over that person, which is the language utilized also in the book of Psalms to describe suffering and sometimes punishment and affliction. The breakers and the waves have passed over me. So I said, quoting about himself, I have been driven away from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. Here, Jonah, even though he has been a rebellious prophet so far, he holds to the steadfast hope of being able to go and look toward the holy temple of God. Now, whether that's an eschatological hope or whether that is a temporal hope, then that's different. I think the biggest point in this statement, beyond whether it's an eschatological or a temporal statement, meaning for there and now within his circumstance, he is placing his trust in God alone. And if he's placing his trust in God alone, then that means that he is no longer, and we're going to see this continue to wrestle out, he is no longer simply trusting himself to be the one to deliver him, to accomplish things, to empower him to do whatever God is calling him to do. Water encompassed me to my very soul. The great deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. In this particular prayer, we see perhaps what would be if we confess that he was swallowed as whole and not killed, devoured by being bitten into pieces by a great fish, which there's nothing impossible for God. And if we confess that Jonah was a real human being, then we also confess by matter of fact and de facto state, if you will, that God is able to deliver men by ways and means that do not make sense to us today, such as appointing a big fish to take care of him and to swallow him whole. But it's almost like this here we are describing this idea of what does it look like being in the belly of a whale. Not only that, we also see here that it also plays out to this continual issue of he is not where he wants to be. Clearly it seems like he's coming to his senses. The water encompassed me. Again, the seas represent chaos in a ancient Hebrew and Jewish understanding of the cosmos. Water is usually associated with chaos and suffering and pain. We also see here the great deep surrounded me. Again, this is being close to Sheol, which is known to be a place for the rest of the dead. The great deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head instead of being wrapped in a turban, or instead of having a crown of glory. It is the weeds that are wrapped around his head, as though to be a symbol of his shame and a symbol of his distress. Listen to verse 6. I went down to the base of the mountains. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. But you have brought up my life from the pit, O Yahweh my God. Here he understands what's happening to him in the belly of the fish, and he understands that he has been brought very low as a point of humility, and though he's been humiliated for his own good, the earth with its bars is closed behind him forever. But you, referring to Yahweh, have brought up my life from the pit. O Yahweh, my God. Here, what we see is a picture of deliverance, a picture of God's faithfulness, not to simply cast out those that he loves, and yet it is a picture of God being able to use the pain, the suffering, the rebelliousness, and also our stubbornness as a way to lead us closer to Him if we surrender to who He is. What we also see here is, listen to this in verse 7. While my soul was fainting within me, I remembered Yahweh, and my prayer came to you and to your holy temple. Here we have a glimpse into the prophet's mind as he contemplates his situation, what led him to it, and we also see him coming to understanding or to remembrance of who God is. I remembered Yahweh, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. What we see here is he almost comes to his senses in the midst of his trial and suffering, and as he petitions God, who is spirit, everywhere, all at once, without change, in all power, his prayer is now comes before him in the place where he dwells. Now, that could be in heaven, but given that he's an Israelite and he also is a prophet, he's probably referring to the temple. Now, whether we mean the temple of, say, for example, in Samaria, or the temple in Bethel, or the actual temple in Jerusalem, it would be fair to say that he's simply referring to the place where the people come collectively to pray before God. And this is a point of submission. We can also go to the Reformation Study Bible and go to the notes here. And I remember the Lord. The context indicates that the prayer is answered. The importance and effectiveness of prayer are again emphasized, as in verse 2. Again, here we have a true confession of trust upon who God is, not because of what he can do, but because of who he is, period. We also come back to this particular contrast to the other idols. Now, remember, in chapter 1, we meet the sailors who all carry their household or national gods with them. And this is not the same. God is the God of the scriptures. Yahweh is not the same as idols that we can fashion out of wood, metal, precious metals, or even stone. This is the living God compared to idols made by man's hand. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their loving kindness. But as for me, verse 9, I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. Here, what we see is a clear contrast to what we see play out in chapter 1. The sailors pray out to their idols, they are unable to deliver them, each one according to their tradition and rite of religiosity. However, what we see is that when Jonah steps out of the boat, when Jonah speaks to the sailors so that he can be cast overboard, we see him placing his life in God's hand. And what we also see here is that he receives a voice of thanksgiving because of God's deliverance for him, compared to those who are trusting in idols who can not offer loving kindness to them, who cannot offer life or sustenance or delivery from evil and suffering. Only a living God is able to deliver people from points of suffering, points of need and want, to plenty and substantive life, and life in the fullest sense. And so here, Jonah again is just simply confessing, as inspired by the Holy Spirit, that God is worthy of thanksgiving, praise, and adoration because he is not forsaken, because our God is deeply intimate. Our God is deeply personable and he can be known. Then we look at verse 10 as we are looking to the end of this particular chapter. Listen to this. But as for me, I will sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. That which I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. This is the final portion of this prayer. And what we see here is that he comes to understand, because God is who he is, I will submit to him and obey him. Because God is who he says he is, I will worship with my life, with service. And by the way, salvation belongs to our God. Salvation belongs to Yahweh alone. Why is this important? In an ancient worldview where you have multiple idols, gods for every nation, for every tribe, it is important for people to realize that the God of scriptures, or I should say, the God of the scriptures and the God of the Bible, is a God unlike any other idol. This is a God who is able to do abundantly more than we can ever fathom. This is a God who has the power, as Jonah declared in chapter 1, to dish out judgment by using the sea and the waves and the sky. This is a God who no longer, and not only does he rule on land, but he rules over everything in creation. He is a king of heaven. He does not dwell in tents made by men. He does not dwell in temples that are hewn of stone. God dwells in the highest heaven. God dwells over all of creation. His person fills all of creation. We can see him in the creativity of all of the world. We can see him in the awe inspiring and striking places of all creation, whether it's a rainbow, a thunderstorm, a snowstorm, or in the calmness of a beautiful summer day. God is the one who sustains all things. And here Jonah comes to the fullest, highest realization of his prayer. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. This may be also translated to say that God alone is the one who can save. And that is not a small statement, rather, it is a profound statement that makes much of God in his fullest personhood, because God is able to do more than you and I ever could. God is able to do amazing things simply because he is God. And Jonah has now seen that, in that he was running away. God is getting him while he gets into the boat. Even as he takes a nap, there's a storm to hinder him from running away. And even as he is then cast into the sea, God does not let him perish, but God sends a fish to swallow him. And even as he is minding his own self inside of the belly of this great fish, what we also continue to see is that now God is allowing him to live, even through rebellion, even through disobedience, even through disgracing God who is holy, holy, holy. And now Jonah comes to confess that, salvation is God's. I can't earn it. I cannot work for it. I cannot begin to merit it. I cannot do anything to try and say that it is my work. It is fully God's work. It is the prerogative of the divine Godhead, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, to show us great salvation. Now, again, types and shadows. Here we see a similar picture to Jesus. We see Jonah praying in his humanity in the belly of the fish. If you go to the Gospels, particularly the Gospel according to John, which is not a synoptic, but what do you see is In chapter 17, God the Son, Jesus Christ, praying for his disciples, praying for the church, praying for the advancement of the gospel, and praying for those who would believe because of the teaching of men and women who follow him in obedience, starting with the first 12. And one of the things that sticks before us is the intrepid notion of acknowledging God in all of his glory. Where Jonah here is simply acknowledging that salvation is of God, Jesus, because he himself is God, prays for us that we may be delivered not from pain and suffering, but that we would stand firm in the midst of pain and suffering, that we would see his wonders anew because of his great mercy, and that in response to this great love, we would then go and tell the nations about who God is, what he has done, how we have experienced him. And in doing so, in doing that, our hearts, our souls, our minds then begin to fathom the reality of all ages, that God alone saves. No one else, nothing else, no additions, no subtractions, no substitutions. Only God through Jesus Christ the Son saves. And the amazing part is that some 700 years before, here you have the prophet foreshadowing what Jesus would do in all perfection to deliver all of those who place their lives and faith and trust in him. And then not only do we see Jonah praying and praying in such a way that God hears him, not because of the tone of the prayer, the eloquence of the prayer, or the fervor of the prayer, but because God is who he says he is. And verse 10 then shows how God, in his mercy, does not consume the prophet that is running away, but rather gives him a new opportunity to worship him through obedience. Then Yahweh spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto the dry land. Now, if he was in Joppa, in the midsection of the Mediterranean, north of Israel, close to one of the cities of the city of Tyre and Sidon, and he has gone now from that port in Joppa to go out to the sea. Now we see God bringing him back to shore, so he, the prophet Jonah, can then start making the trip to Nineveh, which is quite a journey away from the people of Israel. Another thing for you and I to consider is this, that God in his mercy is not only reaching to the people of Israel right now, but he's also reaching to the people who are oppressing Israel, destroying Israel, and it is a God who is doing amazing work to deliver people. That is the great nature of who God is. And so today, I would encourage us not to give up upon what God is doing to reach out to us. If you're a Christian, then it would be very simple. Just surrender your life, trust in Him, and allow God to do amazing works through you, because that's what He does. He has already prepared them. We have to follow in obedience. And then we just simply come back to surrender to who He is, trust who He is, and we join the great adventure that leads us to redemption. So, this is episode 2 of this series, or technically episode 3 after the introduction, Mercy in the Deep. I am Carlos Garduño, and this is Disciple Makers. If you are not going to a church, come and visit us if you're near Albuquerque in the East Mountains to Vista Grande Church. If you are already connected to a church, bless your pastor, serve, share the gospel, encourage him, be active in the membership. And if you're not a Christian, surrender your life to Christ. I guarantee you, it's not easy, but it is worth it. May God have his way in your life. We'll see you next week.